I still remember the smell of that boardroom: polished oak, cold air conditioning, and the faint hum of power. It was supposed to be the day my career finally turned a corner. After years of 16-hour days, late-night reports, and fixing mistakes that weren't mine, I was finally up for a promotion that everyone knew I'd earned. But as I sat there, watching the executives file in with their rehearsed smiles, I felt something shift, a quiet, invisible tension in the air. My name was on the shortlist, but I could already tell from the way they avoided my eyes that the decision had been made long before I walked in when they called out his name instead of mine, the junior analyst who couldn't even balance a quarterly sheet without help. The applause that followed sounded like mockery. My heart didn't just sink, it froze. Every cell in my body went still as I smiled and clapped along, pretending it didn't matter. Pretending I wasn't burning inside. They said it was a strategic decision, a polite phrase for something uglier. Because the truth? The numbers that earned me that promotion had also exposed something. A set of discrepancies buried deep in the merger data. I'd flagged them in my report weeks ago, and now the person who ignored them was being rewarded. That's when I understood. This wasn't about merit. It was about control. I had stumbled too close to something they didn't want anyone touching. And denying my promotion wasn't punishment. It was a warning. But they made one mistake. They thought humiliation would silence me. For a while, it did. I smiled in the halls, attended the congratulatory meeting, even brought coffee for the team that replaced me on the project. I let them believe I was obedient, defeated, harmless. But in the quiet moments, between the fake smiles and forced laughter, I started collecting pieces: emails, notes, meeting records, old expense trails that didn't add up, and the deeper I dug, the darker it got. There were ghost accounts tied to shell companies, unauthorized fund movements masked as consulting fees. It wasn't just greed. It was systemic corruption, orchestrated by the same people who had decided I didn't fit the vision. I stopped being angry. I started taking notes. Every shred of betrayal became a breadcrumb leading me closer to the truth, and as I pieced it together, I realized something haunting. Their entire empire was built on lies. The kind that couldn't survive daylight. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need revenge fueled by rage. I just needed patience and precision, because sometimes silence is the loudest weapon. They thought I was invisible, but I was watching, waiting, learning exactly where to press for everything to fall apart. And when the time came, when the final document landed on my desk, connecting every hidden dollar to the top floor, I knew their world was about to burn. The promotion they denied me, that was the spark. But what came next? That was the fire they never saw coming. The week after the promotion announcement was a blur of forced congratulations and fake empathy. People I'd mentored, the same ones who once asked for my help before every quarterly review, now avoided eye contact in the hallway. That's how office politics worked. When power shifted, loyalty evaporated. Still, I kept my head down. I arrived early, stayed late, and kept my calm even when whispers echoed around me. It wasn't pride that held me there. It was curiosity. I wanted to see how far they'd go. How deep this network of greed truly ran. The one person I couldn't ignore was Ethan, the man who got my promotion. He strutted through the corridors like a child wearing his father's suit. Too proud, too loud, too fragile to realize the walls were watching. His smile was all teeth, his handshake too tight, like he needed to remind me who won. "Guess hard work pays off," he said one morning, his tone syrupy with arrogance. I smiled back. "Eventually," I replied, my voice steady, calm. Inside, I memorized every word. People like Ethan never lasted long. They were pawns, useful to the real players upstairs. The real puppeteers were higher up: Marcus, the CFO, and Evelyn, the CEO. Marcus had a talent for hiding theft in plain sight, dressing it up as creative accounting. Evelyn, on the other hand, was the face of charm. She could sell an apology like it was a gift and convince anyone her decisions were strategic. But beneath her polished speeches, there was a chill. The kind that came from knowing she'd never be caught. Or so she thought. In finance, numbers tell stories, but only to those who listen carefully. I began to notice patterns in the data no one else cared to question, reimbursements that looped through offshore vendors, consultants who had no digital footprint, bonus payouts issued to names that didn't exist. Each time I stumbled on one of these trails, I saved it, quietly, securely, encrypted on a personal drive. I told no one, not even Maya, my closest friend in the office, who once warned me, "You can't fight them. They always win." Maybe she was right. Maybe most people couldn't. But I wasn't like most people anymore. The betrayal had stripped away something in me, that naive belief that merit mattered. What replaced it wasn't bitterness, it was focus. Cold surgical focus. Every late night became a step deeper into their web. I wasn't sabotaging them yet. I was studying them. And then one Friday evening, while combing through archived files, I found the first real crack, a consulting invoice approved under Marcus's signature, billed to a company that didn't exist 6 months earlier. When I traced it, I discovered it had the same IP access as one of our internal accounts, meaning it was created from inside. That night, I didn't go home. I sat in the dim glow of my monitor, staring at the evidence. My hands trembled, not from fear but realization. I wasn't looking at a one-time mistake. This was architecture. Planned, layered, protected. The system was corrupt, and I was sitting at its nerve center. I closed the document, saved a copy, and looked out the window at the city lights. From up here, the skyline looked peaceful, unaware of the rot beneath its brightest towers. And I promised myself one thing. I wouldn't expose them yet. Not until every piece was in place. Because if I was going to bring them down, it wouldn't be with noise. It would be with precision. And when their empire fell, they wouldn't even realize the foundation was already gone. The more I uncovered, the less I slept. Days blurred into nights, and the quiet hum of the office became a soundtrack to my obsession. Every spreadsheet I opened, every transaction I traced, pulled me deeper into a labyrinth that seemed endless. It started small, one invoice, one payment, one anomaly. But soon, it became a pattern. A rhythm of deceit beating beneath the surface of everything we built. Marcus's name appeared more often than coincidence could justify. Evelyn's approvals followed every questionable transfer, and the consulting firms? They were ghosts. No employees, no addresses, no clients. Just empty shells funneling millions through silence. I began to realize what kind of machine I was standing in. They weren't just cooking books. They were feeding a monster, one made of greed, pride, and power. Still, I kept my mask on. To everyone else, I was the same quiet analyst who followed rules and asked too many questions. Ethan, in his newfound arrogance, even started giving me advice. "You should stop chasing ghosts," he said one day, leaning on my desk with that smug grin. "If you keep digging, you'll end up in places you don't belong." He meant it as a threat disguised as kindness. I looked up and smiled. Maybe that's exactly where I need to be. He laughed, walked away, and didn't realize that his words only fueled my resolve. A few days later, I got an email from Evelyn's assistant inviting me to a strategic review meeting. My gut twisted. That kind of meeting wasn't a reward. It was a reminder of power. The conference room was cold, deliberate. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, her calm eyes assessing me like I was a chess piece out of place. Marcus sat beside her, fingers tapping his pen in rhythm, silent but watchful. "Your reports have been detailed," Evelyn said, her tone soft but sharp, almost too detailed. "We appreciate initiative, but sometimes curiosity can be distracting." It wasn't a warning, it was a leash. She wanted to remind me I was replaceable. I kept my expression neutral. "Understood," I said. But inside, something shifted again. This wasn't just corruption, it was arrogance. They were so certain no one could touch them. They didn't even bother hiding the threat. When I walked out of that room, I didn't feel fear. I felt clarity. They knew I was looking, and that meant they were scared enough to notice. That night, I opened the encrypted folder on my drive. Inside it sat weeks of evidence, internal communications, duplicate invoices, and the shell company registry data I'd quietly pulled through connections. It was enough to start a storm, but not to end one, because taking down a system like this required more than proof. It needed timing and leverage. So I started playing their game. I volunteered for new projects, smiled at their jokes, attended every corporate dinner I used to avoid. The closer I stood to them, the more invisible I became. People rarely question those who look content. Behind my calm, I listened. Every careless whisper, every drunken brag at a company party added another thread to the web. And slowly I began connecting the dots. A secret offshore fund tied to one of our biggest clients. A set of transactions routed through their personal accounts. It wasn't just internal fraud. It was collusion. They weren't just stealing from the company. They were the company. That realization chilled me more than anything. Because now I understood what I was really up against. Not one greedy CFO or a power-hungry CEO, but an entire hierarchy built on deceit. And if I wanted to bring them down, I couldn't just reveal the truth. I had to collapse the illusion. Still, doubt haunted me. Late at night, when the office was empty, I'd catch my reflection in the window. Tired, pale, eyes hollow. What if Maya was right? What if they were untouchable? But then I'd open another document, another email, another lie, and the fire would return. They took what was mine out of greed. Now, I was taking what was theirs out of justice, and as I stood at the edge of the truth, one question echoed in my mind like a drumbeat. If you expose the monster from within, can you survive the collapse that follows? It wasn't a single act of betrayal that hurt the most. It was the slow, deliberate realization that the people I trusted the most were part of the game. Maya, my closest ally in the office, had always been my confidant. Or so I thought. She was the one I shared late-night frustrations with, the one who reminded me I deserved better when the promotion was stolen. But one afternoon, as I pored over a new batch of suspicious invoices, I saw her name on an internal memo approving a transfer tied to one of Marcus's shell companies. I froze. At first, I told myself it was a mistake. Maybe she was coerced. Maybe it wasn't real. But the deeper I dug, the clearer it became. She wasn't just silent. She was complicit. She had chosen loyalty to them over loyalty to me, over loyalty to the truth. And then came Ethan. The man who stole my promotion walked past my desk that morning with a smug grin and a folder in his hand. "Thought you'd like to see this," he said, dropping it casually. Inside were reports I had meticulously compiled, the ones that tied fraudulent transactions to Marcus and Evelyn, marked up with notes in his handwriting, ready to present as his own work to the board. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rip the folder out of his hands, but I didn't. I forced a smile and nodded. "Thanks," I said, though my voice was flat. That day, I realized they weren't just underestimating me. They were using me. Every document I'd flagged, every number I'd questioned, every careful note I'd made had been feeding their ego, helping them cover the very tracks I was trying to expose. It was more than professional betrayal. It was personal. I went home that night, exhausted, frustrated, and angry in a way I hadn't felt before. Betrayal cuts deeper when it comes from people you trust. And Maya, Ethan, even the quiet nods of colleagues who once supported me, all whispered the same message. You are alone in this fight. But solitude has a strange power. It sharpens the mind, focuses the will. That night, in the dim light of my apartment, I pored over every piece of evidence I had, every email, every transaction, every tiny clue. I realized something crucial. They were arrogant. They believed they were untouchable. They believed their web of lies was invisible. And arrogance is a weapon. I stopped seeing the betrayal as an obstacle. I started seeing it as leverage. If they thought I was powerless, that meant I could move freely, plan carefully, and wait for the perfect moment to strike. The betrayal didn't break me. It refined me. It became a lens through which I viewed every interaction, every meeting, every casual remark. I began to anticipate their moves, to understand where their confidence came from, and more importantly, where it could be shattered. That weekend, I made a decision. I wouldn't confront anyone yet. No accusations, no explosive confrontations. First, I would gather enough evidence that their entire empire would collapse on its own. Then, when the moment came, it would be undeniable, irrefutable, a storm they couldn't hide from even if they tried. By Monday, I returned to the office with a calm exterior, a mask perfected by betrayal. Maya smiled at me as if nothing had happened. Ethan passed by, pride written across his face, and Marcus, oblivious, continued to manipulate numbers, believing himself untouchable. I let them think they'd won. I let them think the betrayal had silenced me. But deep inside, I was already moving pieces on a chessboard they couldn't even see. Every lie, every stolen promotion, every quiet act of betrayal had led to this moment. And I was ready, because betrayal is a knife. But I had learned to use it too. And when I finally struck, it wouldn't just be revenge. It would be justice. I needed a plan that was surgical, not loud. A way to pull one thread and watch the whole tapestry unravel. Angry outbursts would get me fired. Quiet accusations would be buried. So I built a plan that used their own arrogance against them, piece by piece. First, secure every scrap of proof. I copied everything. Invoices, emails, access logs, meeting notes, onto 3 encrypted drives. One stayed with me, one went to a safety deposit box under a fake name, and the third I uploaded, encrypted, to an anonymous cloud account only I could unlock. Redundancy wasn't paranoia. It was insurance. If they tried to erase me, the truth would still live. Second, create plausible deniability. If I was discovered poking around, I needed a reason. So I volunteered for the internal audit team that was being formed to improve transparency. It was the perfect cover. They applauded my willingness and handed me access to archives and financial trails I'd only dreamed of seeing. Ethan congratulated me, thinking he'd ensured his place. Maya offered a forced smile. They all assumed I wanted to help the company, not destroy the corrupt core. Third, build a chain of custody. Evidence only matters when it's untouchable. I documented every file's origin, time-stamped copies, and cross-referenced logs to prove authenticity. I pulled public records on the shell companies and matched them to internal transfers. I traced IP addresses. I archived screenshots of approvals tied to personal emails. I made it impossible to call it fabricated without admitting their own fingerprints. Fourth, create an external pathway. Internal exposure would be smothered. So I prepared a network. A trusted forensic accountant I'd once helped with. A recommendation, a regulatory contact who owed me a favor from years ago, and an investigative journalist with a reputation for not being bought. I didn't rush them. I only tested the waters. Small, anonymous teases proving there was smoke. Their curiosity was a tool. When they asked for more, I had the full dossier ready, packaged and unassailable. Fifth, manipulate timing. The board would convene in 3 weeks to greenlight a new merger, the perfect stage. If news hit while the deal was live, the fallout would be catastrophic. I timed the release so the documents would land on multiple desks at once. The regulator, the journalist, and a quiet legal counsel within the company who could force an independent audit. Simultaneous pressure leaves no time for cover-ups. Sixth, bait and confirm. I leaked a carefully redacted memo to Ethan. Something that showed I knew certain details, but not everything. He puffed up, flaunting his apparent advantage. That arrogance let me confirm the deeper links. He bragged to Marcus in a confidential message I'd already captured. Their slips filled gaps I hadn't even considered. Seventh, protect myself. I arranged a contingency, a transfer of funds to settle any legal exposure for myself if they attempted to sue. I had a lawyer on retainer, anonymous payments set, up through legitimate channels, and a friend outside the company prepared to act as a public spokesperson if needed. Everything was ready. The evidence was clean. The allies were in place. The timing was set. I didn't need them to admit guilt, just to be exposed in a way the market, the regulator, and the press couldn't ignore. On the final night before the board votes, I sat alone in my car outside the office, the encrypted drive on the passenger seat humming like a small animal. My hands felt steady. I remembered the moment they called Ethan's name over mine. That memory was no longer a wound. It was a compass. The next morning, I would set the machine in motion. I would press one key, send a sealed packet, and walk away with nothing to prove but the truth. They had taken my promotion out of greed. Now, I would take their empire with the quiet certainty of someone who'd spent months becoming the person they never noticed. What followed would not be pretty. It wouldn't be clean. But it would be inevitable. And when the first window of scandal blew open, there would be no hands to stop the rest from crashing through. The morning the world learned their secret, the office smelled different. Not the ordinary coffee and paper scent, but something electric, like the air before a storm. I arrived before sunrise, as I always did, because routine had become my armor. The city outside was still waking, unaware that whatever they called stability would fracture before lunch. I didn't push a dramatic red button. I did something quieter, surgical. I sent the sealed packet to 3 places at once: the regulator's secure drop, the investigative reporter's encrypted inbox, and the legal counsel I'd convinced to act as a failsafe. Each contained the full dossier, the chain of custody, and a cover letter politely demanding an immediate independent review. Attached were the screenshots, the IP traces, the shell company registrations, and the emails with Marcus's signature. There was no opinion, no flourish, only evidence laid bare. At first, nothing happened. For a terrifying minute, I imagined I'd miscalculated. Then my phone buzzed. An anonymous tip had reached the journalist's desk with a subject line that read, simply, "Urgent, audit evidence." Within an hour, an editor called me with questions I'd anticipated. The regulator replied with a polite, formal acknowledgement and a promise to open a preliminary inquiry. The legal counsel forwarded the packet to the board under a formal request for an independent audit. The air moved. By mid-morning, the rumor mill did what raw evidence never could. A junior analyst texted me a screenshot of a headline forming in a business chat room. Within minutes, the newsroom had pieced together the outline. Offshore funnels, fake consultancies, transfers tied to personal accounts. The company intranet crashed under the load of employees searching for answers. Phones started ringing, frantic, pleading, the kind of noise one hears when a building creaks under load. I walked the corridors like a ghost. People stared in a new light, some with fear, some with betrayal written in their faces, and others with the cold calculation of those who, until moments ago, thought themselves untouchable. Marcus's office door was shut. Evelyn's assistant paced. Ethan's face, when I passed him, was a mask of disbelief and panic. He looked at me like a man who'd been playing with dynamite and finally understood the burn. The first public report dropped at noon. The journalist's piece was precise, surgical, and merciless. Timelines, documents, quotes from anonymous internal sources. It called for accountability and for immediate oversight. The stock price looped like a pulse, one sharp inhale and then a catastrophic exhale. Shareholders demanded answers. Calls flooded the boardroom. Regulators issued statements. The merger talks halted. In a matter of hours, spreadsheets that had looked stable for years began to fray at the edges. Evelyn called an emergency meeting, her voice steady in public but thin behind closed doors. Marcus denied everything with practiced calm, but when the auditors started asking for raw bank statements, his composure cracked like glass. Ethan tried to plead ignorance, but auditors had his emails and his stamped approvals. Maya didn't meet my eyes. They scrambled like sailors on a sinking ship, shouting, rearranging, trying to patch leaks with denials and delays. Their PR team drafted statements about internal discrepancies, promising full cooperation. But the pattern was too clean, too ruthless. The evidence was not a rumor anymore. It was a map with their fingerprints. Outside the conference room, I watched the boardroom become a theater of collapse. Men and women who had once seemed invincible were suddenly small and exposed under the bright lamps of scrutiny. Executives were escorted out for questioning. The legal counsel I'd trusted delivered the independent audit request and did not flinch. The regulator froze certain accounts. News outlets speculated about criminal referrals. Contracts were suspended. The merger, their golden jewel, dissolved like sugar in rain. I felt no triumph in those hours, only a hollow clarity. The world they'd built on secrecy and shade was dissolving, and with it came real consequences. People would lose jobs. Families would feel the ripple. Karma wasn't a neat scoreboard. It was a storm that didn't care who got wet. When the boardroom doors finally opened, Marcus's shoulders sagged. Evelyn looked at me once, a quick, measuring glance, and in it I saw something I hadn't expected. Not only fear, but a strange, thin sorrow, like someone realizing how easily everything could have stayed whole if honesty had lived here. They had crushed my promotion out of greed. I had become the reason their company collapsed. But as the investigators led them into interviews and cameras flashed like a relentless rain, I understood the last sharp truth. Exposing a lie never returns everything you've lost. It earns you the truth, and sometimes that is both grace and punishment. The city skyline outside the glass shimmered, indifferent. Inside, the empire was unfastening, one hinge at a time. I stood alone for a long moment, listening to the slow, inevitable sound of a structure giving way. Then I turned and walked away, knowing the next steps would demand choices I'd not yet made. Because collapsing an empire is one thing. Living in the silence that follows, that is another story entirely. The storm had passed, but the air was heavy with aftermath. The company I'd once called a second home was unrecognizable. Offices were quiet, some empty, others buzzing with auditors and legal teams combing through what remained. Marcus and Evelyn were gone, suspended pending investigation. Their carefully built empire reduced to shattered spreadsheets and whispered rumors. Ethan was nowhere to be seen. Even Maya had vanished, swallowed by the chaos she helped create. I walked through the office one last time, quietly observing the wreckage. Employees exchanged glances filled with fear, relief, and confusion. Some had lost positions. Others felt vindicated, but everyone sensed the shift in power. A reckoning long overdue. For me, it wasn't about revenge anymore. The promotion, the stolen recognition, it all faded in comparison to the clarity I'd gained. I had faced betrayal, played the game, and emerged intact. The satisfaction wasn't in watching them crumble, but in knowing truth and integrity still mattered. I left the building that evening, stepping into the city lights with a sense of quiet closure. The empire that once seemed untouchable had fallen, and I had survived, stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. Some victories are silent. Some lessons are earned, and sometimes the aftermath is where you find your real strength. Looking back, the lesson was clear. Greed and arrogance can build empires, but they can't hide the cracks forever. People will try to silence you, steal what's rightfully yours, and use betrayal as a weapon. But the real power lies in patience, focus, and the courage to act when the time is right. I didn't set out to destroy anyone. I set out to survive, to protect myself, and to ensure that truth had a chance. In the process, I learned that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives quietly, methodically, and leaves the guilty exposed by their own choices. Karma isn't immediate, but it is inevitable. As for me, I walked away from the wreckage with more than relief. I walked away with clarity. I knew my worth, my abilities, and the strength I carried quietly while others underestimated me. Betrayal can hurt, but it can also sharpen, refine, and reveal the resilience we never knew we had. And the empire they built on lies, it collapsed under its own weight, proving that shortcuts, deceit, and greed always have a price. This is Karma Unfolded, where every secret finds its reckoning. Don't forget to subscribe.